Tonight, you will tuck someone in. Maybe a child. Maybe just yourself, phone in hand, scrolling one more story before sleep. You will lower your voice. You will slow down. You will say the words that mean it is safe to close your eyes now. It feels small. A habit. A ritual passed down without much thought. But the real answer to why you do this is far stranger than habit. It reaches back before language had grammar, before fire had a name, into the coldest, darkest hours your ancestors ever survived. Your brain did not evolve to enjoy stories for no reason. Nothing about the brain is free. Every part of it costs calories your ancestors did not always have. So when you feel that pull toward a story right before sleep, that pull was built. It was selected for. It kept people alive long enough to pass on the genes that make you crave it tonight. Picture a group of early humans, maybe 50,000 years ago, gathered around a fire as the sun drops. The temperature falls fast once the light goes. Predators that slept through the heat of the day are just waking up. This is the most dangerous window of the entire day. And what do the anthropological records and the few hunter-gatherer societies still studied today show people doing in this exact window? Not working, not foraging, not fighting, talking. In 2017, anthropologist Daniel Smith and his colleagues studied the Agda, a hunter-gatherer community in the Philippines, and recorded what people actually talked about around the fire at night versus during the day. During daylight hours, conversation was mostly about practical matters, complaints, gossip, logistics. But after dark, more than 80% of conversation shifted to storytelling. Not random storytelling. The stories nearly always had a purpose. They passed down social rules. They explained why cooperation mattered. They warned, why would a species evolve to swap complaints for stories the moment the sun goes down? Because storytelling did something gossip could not. Researcher Michelle Scalise-Sugiyama has spent decades studying storytelling through an evolutionary lens, and her research points to something you have probably never considered. A story is a piece of technology. Not metal, not stone, but information technology. A story lets someone transmit a dangerous experience to someone else without that person having to survive the danger themselves. Think about what that means. If your ancestor Aki wandered too close to a river at dusk and was nearly killed by a crocodile, that information was worth almost nothing if it died with Aki's fear. But if Aki turned it into a story, told it that night by the fire, added a bit of tension, maybe gave the crocodile a name, suddenly every child listening now carried that danger in their mind without ever having to face it. The story was a vaccine, a small, survivable dose of fear that built immunity against a much larger threat. This is why nearly every culture on Earth, separated by oceans and thousands of years with no contact between them, independently developed bedtime stories that feature the same core ingredients. A journey into darkness, a predator or a trickster, a rule that gets broken, and a character who survives, but only just and only because they learned something. Notice what almost never happens in a traditional bedtime story. The hero rarely wins through raw strength alone. They win through cleverness, patience, or listening to a warning they were given earlier. That is not an accident of storytelling craft. That is the entire evolutionary point. Strength was common. Everyone in a hunter-gatherer band could throw a spear. What was rare, and what kept a group alive across generations, was the transmission of memory, of rules, of who to trust, and what to fear and when. Here is where it gets stranger. Robin Dunbar, the anthropologist famous for identifying the cognitive limits on how many stable relationships a human brain can maintain, has also researched what actually holds human groups together at that scale. His work suggests that language itself may have evolved less for sharing facts, and more for something closer to social glue, the human equivalent of a chimpanzee grooming another chimpanzee's fur. Gossip, in his framing, is not a character flaw. It is the mechanism that lets humans track reputation across a group far larger than any primate troop could manage face-to-face. Storytelling is gossip's older, wiser cousin. Gossip tells you what someone did yesterday. A story tells you what kind of person does that sort of thing and what happens to them because of it. One is data, The other is a moral compass, wrapped in narrative so it slides past your resistance and lodges directly in memory. You were built to remember stories far better than you remember lists. Ask yourself something. Can you recite the 7 habits of highly effective anything? Probably not. But can you still recall, word for word in some cases, a fairy tale someone told you when you were 4 years old? Almost certainly yes. Your memory did not evolve to store spreadsheets. It evolved to store narrative, because narrative is how survival information was passed down for over 100,000 years before writing existed at all. Now think about why these stories were told specifically at night, and specifically to children who were about to sleep. Nightfall was, for nearly the entire span of human existence, the single most dangerous and least controllable part of daily life. No electric light, no locked doors in most environments, limited vision, increased predator activity. A child who is afraid of the dark is not broken. A child who is afraid of the dark is running an ancient, correctly calibrated threat detection system. The fear came first. The story came second, as a way to manage that fear without suppressing it entirely, because suppressing it completely would have gotten people killed. A bedtime story does something remarkably specific to a nervous system on edge. It presents danger, but inside a container. A beginning, a middle, and most importantly, an end. The wolf comes. The wolf is defeated or outwitted or simply passes by. The story closes the loop that raw fear leaves open. This is likely why calm, rhythmic storytelling has been shown across multiple studies to lower heart rate and reduce measurable stress markers in listeners, children and adults alike, in a way that simply being told there is nothing to be afraid of does not. You cannot talk yourself out of fear, but you can be told a story that resolves it for you. Consider what this means about the shape of the stories themselves. The slow, repetitive pacing you hear in a bedtime story is not a stylistic accident. Repetition mimics the safety of a familiar, unchanging environment, which is exactly what a nervous system on high alert is searching for. The soft, descending tone of a parent's voice at the end of a bedtime story mirrors, almost exactly, the tone used across unrelated cultures to signal safety to an infant. You did not learn this tone. It appears to be closer to instinct than performance. So when you slow your voice tonight, when you lower it at the end of a sentence, when you choose a story with a clear beginning and a clean resolution, you are not improvising. You are running a program that is older than your language, older than your religion, older than your name for the place where you live. There is a modern mirror to all of this that most people never notice. Long after the physical dangers of the ancestral night have disappeared from most of the developed world, the instinct has not gone anywhere. It has simply changed shape. The true crime podcast you fall asleep to. The fantasy audiobook. The show you rewatch specifically because you already know how it ends. All of it is the campfire relocated. All of it is the same nervous system asking for the same thing your ancestors' children asked for 50,000 years ago. Contain danger, followed by resolution, followed by rest. Even the shows and stories adults consume before bed tend to follow the ancient shape more closely than people realize. A threat is introduced. Time is spent inside that threat, close enough to feel real. And then, before the lights go out, it resolves. If it does not resolve, if the danger stays open-ended, most people report feeling unsettled rather than soothed. That is not a coincidence. That is 50,000 years of selection pressure telling you exactly what an ending is for. Which brings this back to tonight. When you tell a story before sleep, or when you ask for one, you're taking part in the oldest surviving piece of technology your species ever built. Older than the wheel, older than agriculture, older, in all likelihood, than most of the words you are using to think about it right now. It was never really about entertainment. It was about survival passed hand to hand, voice to voice, fear to comfort, until the sun came up and it was safe to be afraid of something else instead. So tonight, when you lower your voice and slow down at the end of the day, remember what you are actually doing. You're not just telling a story. You are lighting the last fire your ancestors ever needed, so that whoever is listening can finally close their eyes.